안녕하세요. 스티븐 앨런 씨. 한국에 오신 것 환영하고요. 저희의 인터뷰 요청에 응해주셔서 고맙습니다. 앨런 씨는 유럽에서 탈시설 활동을 하고 계시는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 본인과 본인이 속한 조직, 그리고 활동들에 대해 소개해주세요.
Firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to come and meet you today. In fact, it's a great privilege for me to learn about your work also, and so I hope we'll have some time to exchange on this. By way of initial introduction, I'm Stephen Allen, the Executive Director of the Validity Foundation. We are headquartered in Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary, as an international human rights organisation, and we operate both in Europe but also in Africa, promoting the human rights of persons with disabilities, particularly using legal strategies. My organisation was established in 2002 to help tackle some of the most widespread and systematic human rights violations faced by persons with intellectual disabilities, persons with psychosocial disabilities, and people with multiple disabilities and those with complex support needs. Those issues, broadly speaking, come under three international campaigns that we focus on. The first relates to the right to independent living and deinstitutionalization. The second relates to the right to legal capacity, which is often very closely linked to issues around independent living. And the third relates to the right to inclusive education for children with disabilities. And then just to sort of complete the introduction, we have three main ways that we work. The first way is that we act as a legal resource to the movements of persons with disabilities in Europe and Africa. And that means we help people take cases which aim to achieve systematic change in the country concerned. So that's our main way of operating. Secondly, we act as a watchdog of governments, and this means both in the implementation of national policies, but we also go to visit institutions for persons with disabilities and conduct human rights monitoring or community-based services. And then third and finally, we believe that change can only happen under the leadership of persons with disabilities affected by these human rights violations. And so we work to bring organisations and activists with disabilities into coalitions to strengthen each other through mutual support, such as through global coalition around the institutionalization.
저희 단체는 뇌성마비와 같은 이동, 교육, 노동, 의사소통, 사회참여 등 특정 분야가 아닌 복합적인 지원을 필요로 하는 사람들의 권리 보장에 관심을 가지고 있습니다. 탈시설 과정에서 가장 마지막까지 고민될 수밖에 없는 그룹이 지적자폐 그룹과 우리 중증중복의 뇌성마비 장애인들이 아닌가 생각되는데요. 중증중복 뇌병변장애인들의 탈시설을 위해서는 어떠한 정책들이 필요할까요? 유럽 각 나라들의 대표적인 정책들이 어떤 것이 있는지 소개해 주세요.
So, your question here is about why I think persons with higher support needs are often the last in line for assistance under public policy programs. To answer the first part of your question, I think that the phenomenon you describe is not unique to Korea. Indeed, people with higher support needs in Europe, in North America, but even as we see also in our work in Africa, they are often least prioritised in national public assistance programs, such as social assistance schemes, deinstitutionalisation processes, and of course in terms of receiving individual support that they require to live independently. And I think that this is still a challenge for us in Europe today. I think in part the reason for this is the stigma associated with people higher support needs. Often even in the language, we use terminology that is disableist. We talk about it being complex to help people. We talk about people not being able to manage a variety of services that may be required. And so the language itself almost disables policymakers from thinking it is possible for persons with higher support needs to manage their own living arrangements. And I think we need to tackle it even at the level of the language that we use. If I may, the second aspect of this problem is that the professions that historically have provided support to persons with higher support needs have often been placed in physical, large institutions. This means that they're not accessible in the community, they're often inaccessible outside of urban settings. And this is a fundamental barrier, I think, to moving forward with the genuine transition of people from institutional care to living independently in the community. What we need to be thinking of is how we can ensure that the full range of professionals, whether they be speech and language therapists, nurses, educators, the whole range of professionals required, how can we ensure that they are more available and accessible in our communities and in all communities, not just in cities, but for those who live outside of cities, and for those, of course, who may have or do not have families or other support networks around them. And I think this is a crucial component of the deinstitutionalization process. We don't only need to close institutions, we need to make sure that professionals are trained so that they can go out into the community. And I'll add as a final point that personal assistance schemes, of course, are absolutely fundamental, ensuring that persons with disabilities themselves can organise their own networks of support and assistance. In our view, there are often two big mistakes made in deinstitutionalization processes. The first is that institutions are never actually fully closed, but they are changed into service support centres. Now, this seems like a good idea initially, but what it means is that the services remain concentrated around a particular geographical location, and this has huge implications for persons with disabilities. So we think that this is a real mistake. The second mistake that is often made is that persons with the highest support needs are left to the end of the institutionalization processes. Now, here you've asked for examples of European countries that have a better trajectory on this. I have to say there isn't a single European country that is perfect in any of these respects, but what we do know from more successful deinstitutionalization processes is that firstly, those that start with people with the highest support needs are likely to be the most successful for all persons with disabilities and really create structural change. Secondly, those which place the power and control under persons with disabilities themselves to choose the services they require, to hire the staff they need, and to manage and control those, these actually empower persons with disabilities to have far greater levels of independence and are much more likely to be successful for all persons with disabilities, including those with higher support needs and persons with cerebral palsy.
거주시설은 거주인들의 선택권, 결정권을 제한하고 그들의 삶을 통제하고 관리하는 반인권적인 곳이기에 거주시설은 폐쇄되어야 하며 그곳에서 생활하는 사람들이 지역사회에서 시민권을 가지고 함께 살아가야 한다는 탈시설의 근본 취지에 공감합니다. 하지만 지역사회가 장애인들의 권리를 보장할 수 있는 시스템이 갖추어져 있지 않은 상황에서 탈시설은 자칫 장애인들에 대한 지원의 책임을 가족에게 떠넘기는 것으로 받아들여지기도 합니다. 또한 자기 결정이나 선택권의 보장을 명목으로 보호막을 걷어내 위험에 방치하는 것이 오히려 반인권적인 것이 아니냐는 탈시설 반대 세력의 논리도 중증 중복 장애인들이 많은 우리의 입장에서는 어느 정도 이해가 가는 것이 사실입니다. 장애인을 돌보는 것이 어려워진 가족들이 그를 맡길 시설을 알아봐달라는 민원 전화에 우리는 시설에 반대하니 알아봐줄 수 없고 다른 대안을 찾아보자고 딱 잘라 이야기할 수 없는 것도 우리나라의 현실입니다. 유럽의 탈시설 운동 과정에서도 비슷한 경험들이 있었으리라 생각되는데요. 이러한 문제들에 어떻게 대응해왔는지 사례 중심으로 소개해 주실 수 있을까요?
So I think here you speak about, I think, some of the political and social challenges around deinstitutionalization and the problem that often the family members are left to deal with supporting a person with disabilities in the community. Now, of course, I think that this is a limited reading of Article 19 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 19 speaks about the right to live independently, to be included in the community. It does not speak about the obligation of family members and family members alone to care for and support persons with disabilities. Indeed, the Convention is quite clear that the state itself has a duty to provide direct support to persons with disabilities. And if persons with disabilities themselves wish for family members to be involved, the state has a further obligation to support those family members. It's important to say, however, that the support goes in the first instance to the person with a disability. It should be funded and organised by the state, and it should not push or require persons with disabilities to accept support from family members if this is not what they want. So I do understand the fears of family members who will be left alone, but we have to remember that their criticisms reflect the failure of the state in the first instance to provide effective individual support to persons with disabilities and to their families. I think it's important to say that support is not care. Support is a human right that creates obligations on the state to provide services. So this is the first important thing. Families are not services. Families are families in the first instance. Secondly, I think what we have seen is that when persons with disabilities in Europe are connected with personal assistance schemes and schemes to support in their decision making, they are far more likely to be successful in their transition to community living. And they are far less likely to be totally reliant on the care of family members. Ultimately, care as a paradigm fits when we are speaking about children, because children need care as they grow and as they develop into adults. But for adults with disabilities, I think we've got to be very, very focused on the right to support and to demand, and these are central in the institutionalisation policies. As I said before, closing institutions isn't the main goal of institutionalisation. Indeed, 75% of the effort or more must go into providing individual support to persons with disabilities and also support to families who have persons with disabilities that they care for and live with.
한국의 장애인 복지 운동을 하는 사람들 중 일부는 탈시설에 동의하지만 나이가 들고 자기 선택보다는 누군가에게 의지하는 것이 편해지는 시기가 되면 실버타운처럼 장애인들이 모여 살 수 있는 지원 시스템이 구축된 장애인타운이 필요할 수 있지 않냐고 하는 사람들이 있습니다. 개인적으로도 정말 나이 들어 혼자가 된다면 가족들보다 친한 장애인들과 한 동네에서 마음을 나누며 같이 사는 것도 나쁘지 않겠다는 생각도 듭니다. 유럽에 그 비슷한 대항공동체가 있다는 이야기도 들은 것 같고요. 실제로 그런 대항공동체의 사례가 있나요? 있다면 그 공동체에 대한 평가는 어떤가요? 긍정적인 평가를 하고 있다면 그런 공동체와 거주시설의 차이점은 어떤 걸까요?
So I will read this question because here you are asking about silver towns for older persons, and you're asking about what happens when people reach older age. and whether these types of villages, these alternative villages, are a good idea. I have heard about such of these schemes, such as in the Netherlands, I believe Denmark, and some of the Baltic countries. And I understand why they may seem to be a positive idea from an external perspective, but in our perspective, alternative care villages have some similar issues to the old forms of institutionalization. One of these relates to the fact that they are congregate living settings. This means that they are created with a view to primarily housing persons with disabilities in a close location. So this sounds very similar to the old way of organising institutions. Secondly, the projects we're aware of, and I remember one from, I think it was Estonia, they were established primarily by parents groups, as opposed to persons with disabilities themselves. And of course, those parents had naturally fears about what would happen to their children as they got older, and thereafter, of course, as the persons with disabilities got older. Now, these are all the good intentions, but I'm afraid they are the same types of intentions that result in persons with disabilities being institutionalized. Thirdly, and regardless of the quality of the living arrangements, I think there is always a risk when creating such villages of social segregation and of reinforcing separatist and discriminatory notions concerning persons with disabilities. This is why the Convention doesn't explicitly ban a specific living arrangement, but it does say that persons with disabilities must have choice and control over where and with whom they live. I think the problem with some of these alternative village schemes is that they then became social policy, public social policy, and persons with disabilities often don't have a real choice as to whether they live in them or not. But I think there's another important part of your question here, which is about the need for connection with other members of the community and also connections between persons with disabilities to provide support and mutual aid. These, I think, are extremely important goals that can and should be met in many other ways. For example, the guidelines on deinstitutionalization make clear that organizations of persons with disabilities, and particularly those leaving institutions, must be supported, and that peer support is a crucially important component in preventing segregation and social isolation of persons with disabilities. Of course, also it's crucial to support organisations to support disability culture, and really to take a leading role by those organisations in sensitising wider society and our communities about the human rights and citizenship of persons with disabilities. So I think your question is not wrong. I think the problem is that when we start to think of separate villages or separate places for persons with disabilities, we undermine the essential goal of the Convention, which is to ensure inclusion and dignity for all persons with disabilities wherever they live. I would be concerned that that was possible depending on the level of control you would have over that. Of course, in society we all have the right to choose who we want to live with. So I think this should be precisely the same for persons with disabilities. I get concerned when we start to pool living arrangements and services. What happens in our experience is that when housing is linked with the other services that persons require, and they're placed all in the same setting, very quickly the ideology of institutionalization can take over, even unintentionally, but due to the power imbalances that occur between service providers and service users, there is this risk, I would say. Now, I would say that I am familiar with something called it's the arch or l'arche in French community model, which was established as living settings for both persons with and without disabilities. And I think this is perhaps a model which is closer to the ideal of social inclusion and equality between persons with and without disabilities. I think the essential component here, however, is all about the choice and control of the person concerned. Choice is only real when there are multiple options. And if it is a choice between an alternative care vision and an institution, then I'm not sure that that would be a very real choice, and certainly not a choice that's compliant with the obligations under the Convention.
탈시설이 성공하려면 장애인과 함께 살 수 있는 지역사회의 인프라 구축이 필요할 것입니다. 특히나 우리 뇌성마비와 같은 복합적인 지원을 필요로 하는 사람들에게는 환경적인 변화와 더불어 개개인에 대한 맞춤형 지원이 필요합니다. 이러한 복합적 지원을 필요로 하는 사람들을 위한 유럽 각국들의 정책들에는 어떤 것들이 있는지 소개해 주세요.
So here you talk about creation of community infrastructure, particularly for persons with complex support needs, and what policies exist in Europe. So I think the policies that we have seen again most successfully are at the municipal or city level, and in particular where we have seen the greatest inclusion of persons with disabilities are in those cities that have adopted universal design principles more widely than simply for an individual category of persons with disabilities. This ensures that the built environment is more accessible for all persons with disabilities. It prioritizes accessible housing and residential settings for persons with disabilities. It also ensures that persons with disabilities can access mainstream public services. And there are the Zero Project Awards, as you probably know, that take place regularly, that award cities and municipalities from Barcelona. It's called the Zero Project Awards. These are European and international award ceremonies for accessible cities for persons with disabilities. And so there have been great developments in cities like Barcelona. I know there have been fantastic developments in cities including Vienna, in Austria. I have to say, sadly, Budapest remains a very inaccessible city. But these sorts of awards are an opportunity to showcase cities, I think, which are far more accessible, including for people with higher support needs. One useful project I also recommend looking at in terms of personal mobility is called the TRIPS project, T-R-I-P-S. It was implemented by the European Network on Independent Living, which you, I'm sure, know of. And they were focused on creating, I think I was reading here, 6 or 7 accessible transport cities. So these include Bologna, Brussels, Cagliari, Lisbon, Sofia, Stockholm, and Zagreb. Now I know all of those cities, they're not all perfectly accessible, but this program was really interesting because it was led by persons with disabilities in co-production with transport authorities in those cities. And they have created very concrete programs to improve personal mobility for persons with disabilities, including those with high support needs, with limited mobility, but also for people, for example, with intellectual disabilities who find it difficult to understand and navigate public transport systems. So I think it's those sorts of schemes that are implemented under the leadership of persons with disabilities, which makes cities and other settings far more accessible for people, not just with disabilities, but also for the elderly, for people who speak different languages or have different requirements. I think universal design is so powerful because it makes our entire society more inclusive, and persons with disabilities in the leadership really make these schemes, I think, more successful in the long run. It shows why, I think, in public policy making, and particularly DI, we cannot have those processes led by the old service providers. The old service structure, or the old service-minded structure, really is about the charity model approach, and they fail, I think, often to understand the barriers that persons with disabilities face when exercising their mobility and their independence in the community. So I think TRIPS project and others similarly are very good examples of the leadership of persons with disabilities.
우리나라의 경우 시설에서 뛰쳐나온 8명의 중증장애인들, 공교롭게도 이들 대부분은 뇌성마비였는데요. 이분들이 서울 한복판에서 노숙투쟁을 시작하면서 한국의 탈시설 위제가 본격적으로 공론화되고, 이분들이 지역사회에 안정적으로 정착하면서 아직 많이 부족하긴 하지만 장애인 정책이 탈시설 자립생활 지원 방향으로 획기적으로 전환되었는데요. 유럽에서도 이렇게 변화의 시발점이 되는 사건이 있었을까요?
And here you speak about 8 persons with disabilities escaping the institution, and this triggering change here in Korea. Is the situation similar or different in Europe? Firstly, I commend the leadership of persons with disabilities who are brave enough to leave that institution and to campaign publicly for a change to the policies here in Korea. Indeed, I think that this is an inspiring example for people around the world, and in short, Europe does not have a comparable example. I think I can give you a few examples of changing points in Europe, bearing in mind that the European Union and broader Europe is a very diverse continent, countries that are very rich, but also countries that are very poor in Eastern Europe, for example. So their trajectories have been quite different. If we look at Central and Eastern Europe and the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, I think the big change came during the transition to democracy. And during that period of time, civil society and persons with disabilities were advocating for people to become more aware of the horrors often that were taking place in some of the big old institutions that exist even to this day in those countries. So in Romania, the European mindset was fundamentally changed when the public saw what was happening in the Romanian institutions of children in situations of starvation, physical restraint, chemical restraint. And that information only came out because of the bravery of activists with disabilities who were willing to collect evidence and information and bring that to the attention of the world. So this is one example of Eastern Europe, I would say, which did trigger some major reforms in those countries. Now, in my own country, in Western Europe, the United Kingdom, deinstitutionalization has been a process ongoing for the last 50 years or so. So it's not a new process. But very much that process was triggered after the end of the Second World War, as the country started to develop a social net for people who are coming back from war, for extremely poor parts of the country that traditionally were industrial communities. And there had been a backlash against the old Victorian ethics in the country at the time, which put poor people, disabled people, and old people into institutions. So there was a sort of social awakening that institutionalization 50, 60 years ago was no longer acceptable. And then the movement really to move more rapidly with the institution always came in the United Kingdom after a public scandal of abuse in an institution. Because it's when those abuses came to light that the public pressure on policymakers increased. And today we still have some institutions in the United Kingdom, but far fewer than back when this process began. And finally, at the more pan-European level, I think one of the things that has been making real change is the independent living movement. This is particularly organisations like the European Network on Independent Living and Centres for Independent Living are now in existence in many European countries. And I think they have become, I think, an effective advocacy force, campaigning for public authorities to shift funding from institutions to personal assistance schemes and to support in the community. Many mistakes have been made in the European Union in the institutionalisation process. But I think the vibrancy of the independent living movement has helped to enhance accountability, and we are now seeing more positive changes where politicians, policymakers know that if they keep investing in institutions, there is a strong movement of persons with disabilities who will speak out publicly and consistently to hold these people to account.
조금 민감한 질문일 수도 있지만 우리나라에서는 2000년대 초 장애인 이동권 투쟁부터 장애인 차별금지법 제정 투쟁, 활동지원 서비스 제도화 투쟁, 탈시설, 자립생활운동 등을 통한 장애인 정책 변화의 주요한 현장 동력은 뇌성마비 당사자 활동가들이었고, 장애인 복지의 주류가 비장애인 전문가에서 장애인 당사자 활동가들로 바뀌어오긴 했지만, 이런 장애인 운동을 이끌어가는 주류에는 얼굴이 일그러지지 않고 의사소통에 장애가 없는 비뇌성마비 장애인들이 자리잡고 있는 것이 현실입니다. 유럽의 탈시설운동, 장애인운동 역사에서 뇌성마비 장애인들의 역할과 위상이 어땠는지 국가별 사례들을 소개해주세요.
And here you are asking about the leadership of persons with cerebral palsy, and particularly in the movement for deinstitutionalization. I'm sorry to tell you that in Europe the situation is no different. Often persons with cerebral palsy or other communication impairments still are not in the key leadership roles, even in European disability civil society. And I think that this is a real issue that we need to be grappling with internationally. Unfortunately, sometimes I see at national disability movements, we still have traditional leaders who have often been in place for very, very long periods of time. In Eastern Europe, some of these people were appointed before the transition to democracy, but still maintain their positions of leadership. And I think, unfortunately, this does sideline the voices, the leadership of not just persons with cerebral palsy, but also persons with intellectual disabilities, persons with autism, and persons with psychosocial disabilities. Disability rights, I think, is an incredibly revolutionary concept for our world and our societies. But disability movements are not always as fully inclusive as they should be, and they must be. And I think I support the implicit question that you have here, is that we should increase the voices and leadership of persons, not just with cerebral palsy, but other marginalised populations too. I would say actually though, one aspect that has been more positive, certainly in my own country, is we are seeing greater representation of persons, particularly with cerebral palsy, in media and in mainstream media. And I think that this has been a really important component in beginning to change perceptions of the capacities of persons with cerebral palsy, but also increasingly now there is a campaign that people with cerebral palsy don't just have to play disabled characters. They can be playing roles of politicians or leaders as well. And I think that's been a positive change. Certainly in the British movie industry, this is happening more and more. And I think it does help to improve representation It's not easy, and it's true. I mean, often journalists have a lot of stigma themselves, right? So what their prejudices will be reflected in their coverage of persons with disabilities. I would say that my organisation over the year has worked with a small number of journalists on a regular basis to educate them and to inform them about the rights of persons with disabilities. And when we do that, we find that we get better reportage and coverage, and of course, slowly the narrative begins to change. But I think you're right, mainstream media, 24-hour news often is very stigmatizing, and so I think it's more important to develop relationships with specific journalists, specific news channels to get the message across, because we know that there are loud voices out there and they're trying to shock people. That's what the media companies are looking for.
지적 자폐성 장애인들에게도 마찬가지이지만 뇌성마비 장애인들에게 있어 자기 선택 및 결정권의 확인 과정에서 가장 중요한 것이 의사소통의 문제라 생각되는데요. 이는 탈시설 과정에서도 중요한 위제라 생각됩니다. UNCRPD는 제21조 의사 및 표현의 자유 및 정보 접근 조항으로 명시되어 있습니다. 하지만 유엔장애인인권위원회의 뇌성마비 당사자가 없어서인지 몰라도 우리 협회의 계속적인 로비 활동에도 불구하고 작년에 발표된 대한민국 최종 권고에는 정보 접근에 대한 권고들만 되어 있을 뿐 의사표현의 자유를 보장하는 내용의 권고는 명확하게 담기지 않아 아쉬웠습니다. 혹시 다른 회원국들의 심의 결과들에서 뇌성마비 장애인들의 의사표현의 자유를 보장하는 권고 내용이 있는지 생각나는 사례가 있으시면 말씀해 주세요.
Well, I also regret that the CRPD committee did not give a clear recommendation under Article 21 to the government of Korea. I think this is probably a symptom of a lack of space, a lack of time in the dialogue. However, I know that the committee are very strongly supportive of the right to freedom of expression of persons with disabilities, and not only that, also freedom of association and the right to be politically active and civilly active. So I do regret it, I must say, that you didn't get the specific concluding observation you require. The committee often focuses on reminding governments of their obligation to ensure accessibility, as you've pointed out. But I think that with further dialogue with the committee, you will find that they will be very supportive of the goals that you have, particularly here. Regarding whether the committee has looked at this question elsewhere, to my knowledge it has come up, particularly when looking at Australia. Australia has quite a good movement of persons with disabilities who use alternative and augmented forms of communication. And so I know it came up in that dialogue. I also know that it came up in a dialogue with Mexico as well. So I think it is there. But I would say probably the jurisprudence under Article 21 is less well developed. So what that means, I think, is not a risk, but an opportunity for the movement. I think it's worth connecting. If you would like, I can try and facilitate some contacts with colleagues from Australia and Mexico, perhaps to put a special focus on this point at one of the upcoming sessions. One of the ways to do that most successfully, in my opinion, is to organise a side event during the committee sessions where you can focus very specifically on this issue. Because you're absolutely right, there is not, to my knowledge, a committee member with cerebral palsy, and they may very well need more education themselves to be able to understand how to give the best recommendations to states parties to the convention. The other final thing I would say on this is don't hesitate to get involved with the CRPD committee elections. They happen every couple of years in New York, And there have been successful campaigns to include a person with an intellectual disability, for example. So now we have Sir Robert Martin from New Zealand as a member of the committee. It's also absolutely the time for a person with cerebral palsy too, and I encourage you to get involved with that campaign.
저희의 인터뷰 요청을 수락해 주셔서 다시 한번 고맙다는 인사드리고요. 앞으로 활동하시면서 저희 같은 뇌성마비 장애인들의 문제에도 관심 많이 가져주시고 지속적인 교류와 연대가 이어지길 기대합니다. 고생 많으셨습니다.
And thank you very much as well. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you. And I agree, it's going to be the beginning of our contact and not the end. So thank you so much.